In Chapter 6, we begin our discussion of energy, and we're going to talk about the types of energy reactions that occur in the cell. And this is all in preparation for Chapter 7, our discussion of cellular respiration, where we look at how a cell takes the energy stored in chemical bonds and turns it into ATP. And Chapter 8, where photosynthetic organisms take in light energy and convert it into chemical energy that can then be used in the process of cellular respiration. Chapter 6 is a lot longer than what I discuss in lecture. This is due to the fact that we have lecture exams stuck into an already tight schedule, and Biology 101 maintains a one chapter a week schedule. So I cut down Chapter 6 by sort of giving a brief introduction to the first two sections, some of our physics and energy terms, and just sort of pull out what I feel is most important for the understanding in the later sections on ATP and enzymes. Please use your study guide to guide you through what you need to know in the first two sections. And essentially it is the types of reactions that occur in a cell. So the collection of all of the chemical reactions in an organism is called the metabolism of an organism. And the metabolic processes of an organism are what transform all of the matter and energy in a living organism. Each of those metabolic reactions is part of a larger metabolic pathway. That is to say that any molecule that you start with is altered in a series of steps until you get to a specific product. Each of those steps is mediated by specialized proteins called enzymes. Enzymes are molecules that affect the rate of a reaction. They affect whether a reaction is going to go, and they change the molecules in a way that allow them to perform their reactions. So they're really important in controlling the progression of these metabolic pathways and the production of the products that we need in our cells. On the right-hand side, we have a line diagram outlining the complexity of the metabolic pathways in an organism. So this is meant to represent all of the pathways. An organism will take in some sort of food source, energy source, or use one that's already being stored in the organism and convert it through a series of steps into whatever product it needs. Central to this set of metabolic reactions is cellular respiration, and that's what we see here. We see this step in which the stepwise pathway in which glycolysis occurs. You break down glucose. It goes through the citric acid cycle, and eventually ATP is produced. And that's our ultimate goal, to look at how cells take in energy and how they convert it into ATP to be used within the cell. Metabolic pathways go two ways. They can either be catabolic pathways, in which materials are broken down and their energy is released from chemical bonds as they're broken. Or we can have anabolic pathways. Anabolic pathways are building pathways where energy is put in to molecules in order to build those more complex biological molecules, and even just any molecules within the cell. Anabolic pathways store energy. I like to remember this as cats break things. I don't know about you, but most of the cats in my life have been jerks. They like to knock things off of tables and shelves. They like to play with things and break them. So that's how I remember the difference between these. Catabolic pathways break down materials. When metabolic pathways break down materials, they come with a release of energy. Reactions that release energy are called exergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions are always catabolic reactions, sort of by definition. These reactions are spontaneous. Spontaneous doesn't necessarily mean quick, as we would normally use the word spontaneous. In this case, when we're referring to reactions and reaction rates, spontaneous means that the reaction goes without an input of external energy. So exergonic reactions release energy but do not require an input of energy to go to completion. Exergonic reactions and their related endergonic reactions are coupled in that the energy used from exergonic reactions can be used to build other molecules. It can be put into other molecules, used for other purposes. And we will talk about endergonic reactions on the next slide. The picture at the bottom is an energy graph. It shows that in exergonic reactions, your reactants are very high in energy, at least high compared to the products. And when they are converted to products, energy is released. This energy is called free energy, and it is symbolized by the symbol delta G. So delta G represents the amount of energy that is released when we convert our reactants into our products. In an exergonic reaction, delta G is always going to be negative because there was a loss of energy from the reactants, a loss of energy from the system. Endergonic reactions require an input of energy. That energy comes from the exergonic reaction. So we say that these reactions are coupled. One powers the other. Endergonic reactions are anabolic reactions. That is, the energy that is put in is needed to build chemical bonds. They are non-spontaneous, which means they require the addition of energy in order to go. Remember, this has nothing to do with rate. Spontaneous with respect to energy reactions has to do with whether or not energy is required. In endergonic reactions, energy is required. Because energy is required and because the molecules, that energy is used to build molecules, endergonic reactions store energy. And as I said a minute ago, that energy comes from the exergonic reactions. Our energy graph here on the bottom shows that reactants are lower in energy than our products. In order for the products to be higher in energy, energy is required, it is put in. And so in this case, we say that our measure of free energy, our delta G, is positive because energy is put in. All of our cells work on the energy currency ATP. ATP is our energy molecule. ATP is the link between our exergonic and endergonic reactions. ATP works by powering all of the cellular processes in our cells. It can do three types of work. It can do chemical work, so it can cause chemical reactions. It can put energy into chemical reactions. It can do transport work. This is the ATP that's involved in our membrane transport that we saw in chapter 5, transport of molecules across a membrane. And then it can do mechanical or movement work. This is work such as moving vesicles or moving microtubules inside a cell. We can see here the structure of ATP. This molecule might actually look familiar to you. This is actually a modified nucleotide that would be found in DNA. So we've got our ribose sugar, our nitrogenous base, in this case it's an adenine, and then we've got 3 phosphate groups, the triphosphate group there. Those phosphate groups are really what causes the transfer of energy. All of those negative charges on those phosphate groups actually store energy through repulsion. So this molecule is really reactive because those two phosphate, or the last phosphate on the end, wants to be released. It's being sort of repelled by those other phosphate groups. And so it sort of acts like a spring. It wants to kick off that last phosphate group. And it's that last phosphate group that's going to be involved in the transfer, the one that moves energy between these endergonic and exergonic reactions. The transfer of energy in ATP involves this movement or this release of that phosphate bond. The exergonic reaction of ATP, that release of that phosphate bond, releases 7.5 kilocalories of energy. This is considered a high amount of energy. You'll just have to take my word for it on that one. But that phosphate, and therefore the transfer of energy, the release of energy, comes through a hydrolysis reaction. In Chapter 3, we talked about dehydration reactions where we were building our biological molecules. In the case of ATP, we're actually breaking that phosphate by hydrolysis and releasing the energy from that bond. With the hydrolysis of ATP and the release of that phosphate, that energy can be used to perform work within the cell. Whenever a chemical reaction occurs and energy is released, a lot of that energy is lost as heat. Breaking that phosphate bond is no exception. But in order for a cell to be able to use the energy in that phosphate bond, it has to be able to harness that energy. So not all of the energy is lost as heat. That heat is helpful, though. When our mitochondria work to produce ATP, that ATP can be used in other cells within our body. For example, in muscle cells, ATP is hydrolyzed, and that provides the energy for our muscle cells to contract. Along with that energy transfer is also the release of heat, and that warms our body. So heat is really important in living organisms to help maintain their body temperature. But we also have to deal with that heat. And so along with that heat, we have mechanisms for cooling down, such as shivering, panting, things like that. But the energy that is harnessed from the ATP can be used to power endergonic reactions. And then, of course, when we are performing these metabolic activities, they are all being performed by enzymes. So it's enzymes that are mediating this release of the phosphate and the transfer of energy. So how does ATP actually perform work? We've said that ATP releases a phosphate. But that phosphate doesn't just disappear into thin air. The transfer of energy with that phosphate comes when that phosphate is actually transferred from ATP to one of our reactants. This occurs by a process that uses what is known as a phosphorylated intermediate. So phosphorylated just means that something acquires that phosphate group. Intermediate just means it's a step in the process. In the use of a phosphorylated intermediate, a phosphate from the ATP is transferred to another molecule. And when it is transferred, that molecule becomes very unstable. Basically, it has acquired energy and it wants to release it. In this reaction, we have glutamic acid being converted into glutamine. Glutamine is an amino acid, and so we have to add a nitrogen group to the glutamic acid. That reaction requires the input of energy. It requires that phosphate group being added to the glutamic acid to make it unstable, to make it want to react. When that happens, it reacts with that amino group and becomes glutamine. What's left is an ADP molecule, an ATP molecule that has lost its phosphate, and then a remaining phosphate that we now call an inorganic phosphate. It's a phosphate that's been removed from the biological molecule. Those ADP molecules and the inorganic phosphate molecules are important because they can actually be recycled back into ATP and used again. This reaction is endergonic because it's building. It requires an input of free energy. And we can see that indicated on the bottom right-hand corner where our input of energy is 3.4 kilocalories. It has a positive input of energy. ATP can also perform transport work and mechanical work. So we saw this example of a carrier protein utilizing active transport in our discussion in chapter 5. And in this case, we are moving solutes against their concentration gradient. And we get a sort of a phosphorylated intermediate from this process as well, in a way. ATP transfers its phosphate to that transport protein, causes it to become a little unstable, causes it to change its shape. Remember, this is a carrier protein. Carrier proteins work by binding a molecule, changing their shape, and then releasing to the other side. And that allows the the plasma membrane to accumulate solutes on one or the other side of the membrane against its concentration gradient. So in chapter 5, we said that this process requires energy. Here we're learning how, and it's via that transferred phosphate group. Again, we end up with our solute moved, and then ADP and an inorganic phosphate are left over. ATP can also be used to power mechanical work. So this is physical work in a cell. It can be used to contract our muscles, to move our ligaments and tendons, but it can also be used inside the cell. So this example here shows a motor protein. That motor protein actually binds to ATP in this reaction, and then that ATP is hydrolyzed. So when that happens, that motor protein there, the red part of that picture, actually moves or walks along the cytoskeleton. In this case, we're carrying a vesicle through the cell. So this might be a vesicle that is started at the Golgi apparatus. It's been modified, it's been packaged in a vesicle, it's been shipped, and now it's being moved along the cytoskeleton track to the plasma membrane where it's going to be released. So energy can be transferred or transformed. It can also be lost as heat. But one of the really important things about ATP is that it can be transformed back into ADP, or I'm sorry, it can be transformed into ADP and then back into ATP again. And the process of cellular respiration is what actually changes ADP back into ATP. But this diagram is really important in understanding the cycle of how that happens. So if we start with ATP and we want to use it in the cell, we first need to hydrolyze it. So we add our water molecule that causes the release of that phosphate group. And then that energy that is released with that phosphate group can be used to perform cellular work. In other words, it can be used to power our endergonic reactions. The ADP molecule and the inorganic phosphate that are produced as a result of that cellular work can then be combined, driven by energy from exergonic reactions. So energy is input into the reaction. It produces a dehydration reaction in which that phosphate group is added to the ADP, and again we get ATP. So ATP really is our link between using our exergonic reactions to power our endergonic reactions. And in transferring the phosphate to our endergonic reactions, that allows us to harness that chemical energy and use it for work.